What would you think if one morning you were told your strongest ally was gone? Not defeated, not retreating, gone. In May 1945, Japan was already fighting a losing war. Cities were burning, supplies were collapsing. Yet inside Japanese war rooms, one belief still existed. Germany was holding the Allies in Europe. Then the message arrived. Berlin had fallen. At first, no one spoke. Because this was not just the fall of a city, this was the collapse of an entire strategy. For years, Japan had believed that as long as Germany fought in Europe, the United States and Britain could never focus fully on the Pacific. Germany was the pressure point, the distraction, the shield. Now that shield was gone. Japanese officers did not rush to conclusions. They never did. Reports were checked, sources verified. German communications were analyzed line by line. And slowly, the truth became impossible to deny. The Red Army was inside Berlin. German command had disintegrated. The war in Europe was finished. But one question remained unanswered. Where was Hitler? Rumors moved quietly through diplomatic channels. Some claimed he had escaped. Others suggested he was still fighting inside the city. No confirmation came immediately. Inside Japan's high command, the uncertainty was dangerous. Because Hitler alive meant Germany might still exist. Hitler dead meant Germany was finished forever. When confirmation finally came, it was brief. Adolf Hitler was dead. There was no reaction the world could see. No statement, no alliance speech, no expression of loss. Inside closed rooms, however, something changed. Germany was no longer a partner. Germany had become a lesson. Japanese generals began studying Germany's collapse with cold attention, not emotionally, strategically. Maps of Europe were no longer battle plans, they were warnings. They asked uncomfortable questions. Why did Germany fight until its capital was destroyed? Why did leadership refuse to accept reality? Why did civilians pay the final price? And slowly, another question formed, one no one said aloud yet. Was Japan heading toward the same ending? Some officers believed Germany had failed because it surrendered too late. Others believed Germany had failed because it did not fight hard enough. The same event produced two opposite lessons, and Japan stood between them. Outside those rooms, Tokyo continued to burn. Civilians slept in ruins. Food lines grew longer. Bombers returned night after night. Yet the war continued because belief still existed. Germany had fallen, but Japan had not yet decided what that truly meant. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment the illusion broke. What do you do when your ally collapses, but your own war is still burning? For Japan, Hitler's death did not bring clarity. It created division. Inside Tokyo's highest war councils, the news from Berlin forced a conversation that had been avoided for months. Germany was gone. Europe was lost. And now, Japan stood alone against an enemy with unlimited resources. But no one said the word surrender. Not yet. The Japanese high command was split, quietly, carefully, and dangerously. On one side were the hardliners. They believed Germany had failed because it lost its will too early. They argued that Japan must never repeat that mistake. To them, Berlin was not heroic, it was tragic. They asked a different question. What was the point of fighting if the nation itself would not survive? These debates did not happen in public. They happened behind closed doors, in rooms where every word mattered. Rank, tradition, and loyalty made open disagreement difficult. Many officers stayed silent, even when they feared the outcome. Above them all stood the emperor. Emperor Hirohito was informed of Germany's collapse carefully through reports stripped of emotion. There is no record of traumatic reaction. Instead, what followed were meetings, long, quiet, unresolved meetings. Japan's problem was no longer Germany, it was time. American bombing had reached unprecedented levels. Entire cities were erased in single nights. Industry was collapsing. Transportation barely functioned. Food shortages were becoming impossible to hide. Yet still, the war continued. Why? Because Japan believed it could shape the ending. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Japan feared the same fate. Leaders hoped that by inflicting enough casualties, they could force negotiations, preserve the emperor, and avoid occupation. Berlin's fall did not end that belief, it strengthened it. Germany, they thought, had given the Allies everything by collapsing completely. Japan would try to give nothing except resistance. But another fear was growing faster than American bombs: the Soviet Union. With Germany defeated, Japan knew the Soviets were free to act. Soviet neutrality was fragile, temporary, and dangerous. If the Red Army entered the war against Japan, there would be no escape. Germany's defeat meant the clock had started. Japan could feel it ticking. And yet, despite all this knowledge, despite all the evidence, no final decision was made. Because once a nation accepts reality, the war is already over. Japan was not ready for that moment. Not yet. What do you learn from a city that refused to surrender until nothing remained? In Tokyo, Berlin was no longer discussed as a battlefield. It was discussed as a symbol. Japanese officers pored over reports describing Germany's final days. They studied the destruction street by street, not with sympathy, but with calculation. Berlin had fought until it collapsed inward. Leadership stayed, orders continued, civilians suffered. To some, this was proof of loyalty. To others, it was proof of failure. The Japanese High Command could not ignore the similarities. Germany and Japan had both built their wars around belief in endurance, belief in destiny, belief that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. Berlin proved otherwise. Yet instead of discouraging resistance, Germany's end became a strange source of inspiration for certain factions. If Germany had delayed the Allies by months through total resistance, Japan could do the same, perhaps longer. Every day bought with blood, they believed, increased Japan's bargaining power. This idea hardened quickly. Defense plans were rewritten, civilian participation was expanded, training manuals emphasized sacrifice over survival. The nation itself was becoming a weapon. But beneath this resolve, doubt spread quietly. Some officers asked what Berlin's resistance had truly achieved. Germany gained no better terms, no protection for its cities, no mercy for its people. Was delay worth annihilation? These questions rarely reached the surface. Speaking openly risked being labeled weak, or worse, disloyal. And then there was the emperor. Hirohito stood at the center of every calculation. His safety, his authority, and his survival were inseparable from the state. Berlin showed what happens when leadership becomes trapped by its own decisions. Japan feared that moment. The lesson of Berlin was clear, yet terrifying. Once a capital becomes a battlefield, control is already lost. Still, Japan continued preparing for exactly that scenario. The home islands would be defended at all costs. Civilians would assist. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. Berlin had fallen, but Japan had chosen not to listen. Not yet. What if the war did not end with America? What if another enemy was already moving, silently? After Germany's collapse, one name began appearing again and again in Japanese war discussions: the Soviet Union. For years, Japan had relied on a fragile understanding with Moscow. A neutrality pact signed in 1941 had kept the northern border quiet while Japan focused on the Pacific. As long as Germany fought the Soviets in Europe, Japan believed that pact would hold. Berlin's fall destroyed that assumption. With Germany defeated, the Red Army was no longer tied down in Europe. Millions of battle-hardened Soviet troops were suddenly free. Tanks, artillery, and logistics that had crushed Berlin could now be redirected east. Japanese intelligence understood the danger immediately. If the Soviets entered the war against Japan, there would be no second front, only collapse. The Japanese army was already stretched thin. Supplies were low. Air power was almost gone. Yet even now, Japan did not move toward surrender. Instead, it moved toward delay. The High Command believed time could still be used as a weapon. If Japan could hold out long enough, perhaps the Soviets could be kept neutral. Perhaps America would negotiate. Perhaps something would change. Berlin had shown what happened when time ran out. That knowledge haunted every meeting. Diplomatic channels quietly increased communication with Moscow. Japan hoped to use the Soviets as mediators with the Allies. The irony was dangerous. Japan was asking a potential enemy for help. Some leaders saw this as desperation. Others saw it as strategy. Inside the military, disagreement deepened. The army wanted to fight on, even if it meant national destruction. The Navy, weakened beyond repair, understood the limits more clearly. Berlin had proven one thing beyond doubt. Modern war did not reward loyalty or sacrifice. It rewarded resources, and Japan was running out of both. As summer approached, the war entered a strange phase. Everyone knew the ending was approaching. No one knew how close it was, and no one knew which enemy would arrive first: America from the air, or the Soviet Union from the north. What do you do when every option leads to loss? By mid-1945, Japan's leadership understood something it had avoided admitting for months. The war could not be won. Factories lay in ruins. Oil reserves were nearly gone. The Navy existed mostly on paper. American bombers flew almost unchallenged. Cities burned faster than they could be rebuilt. Yet still, the Supreme War Council could not agree on surrender. The reason was simple. How a war ends matters as much as how it is fought. Germany's unconditional surrender had become a nightmare example. Japan feared occupation, war crimes trials, and the possible destruction of the imperial system. Berlin showed what happened when leadership lost control completely. Japan wanted a different ending. The plan was dangerous but clear. Inflict enough casualties during an Allied invasion of the home islands to force negotiations, preserve the emperor, avoid total occupation, control the narrative of defeat. Berlin had failed at this. Japan believed it would succeed. Military planners prepared civilians for combat. Men, women, and even students were trained with basic weapons. The entire population was being turned into a defensive force. Some officers called this honor. Others called it suicide. Behind closed doors, the emperor listened. Hirohito was not a military commander, but his authority shaped every discussion. Reports reaching him were increasingly bleak. Advisors struggled to balance truth with loyalty. Germany's example hung over every meeting. Berlin had fought until there was nothing left to protect. Japan feared becoming the same symbol. Yet hesitation remained. No leader wanted to be remembered as the one who ended the war. History punishes surrender more harshly than failure. So the gamble continued. Time would be stretched, casualties would be endured, the enemy would be tested. And somewhere within that suffering, Japan hoped to find leverage. But history does not always allow time, and something was already moving toward Japan, something that would change every calculation. What happens when a nation realizes it waited too long? By the summer of 1945, Japan's leaders were no longer asking how to win the war. They were asking how much of the nation would survive it. Germany's fate had already answered one question clearly. Delaying the inevitable did not soften the ending. Berlin had resisted until it became unrecognizable. Its people paid the price long after the fighting stopped. Japan was now standing at the same edge. American bombing campaigns intensified beyond anything seen before. Entire cities vanished in single nights. Civilian casualties climbed into numbers no one could fully comprehend. Firestorms turned neighborhoods into ash within hours. Still, no surrender came. The belief remained that one decisive moment could change everything. Then the world shifted. A single weapon altered the meaning of time. News reached Tokyo of a destruction so complete that early reports were difficult to believe. A city destroyed in an instant. No prolonged battle, no gradual collapse, just disappearance. For Japan's leadership, this was not just military information, it was a warning. Germany had fallen after months of brutal fighting. Japan was now facing a force that could erase cities without invasion. And then came the final blow Germany had unknowingly prepared Japan for. The Soviet Union entered the war. The fear born after Berlin's fall became reality. Soviet forces moved with speed and certainty, crushing Japanese positions in Manchuria. The neutrality Japan had depended on was gone. The last diplomatic hope collapsed overnight. Germany's lesson was now complete. Fight until destruction, or stop before nothing remains. Inside Tokyo, emergency meetings followed one another without resolution. Hardliners demanded resistance. Realists saw the collapse coming faster than anyone had predicted. And above them all, the emperor faced the same choice Germany never truly made. Berlin had waited until there was nothing left to decide. Japan was being forced to choose now. The war that began with ambition was ending with survival as the only goal. And history was about to record which lesson Japan finally accepted, the one Berlin had written in ruins.